Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's topic is part 2 of the Galadriel series. In the last video, I mentioned that numerous folks have suggested Galadriel as a topic, and I proceeded to butcher the name of one of those individuals, Julian Koning. My apologies, Julian, and I really hope I pronounced it correctly that time. So when we left off, it was the First Age. The Noldor have arrived in Middle-earth against the wishes of the Valar, and Galadriel and her brother Finrod go visit their great-uncle Thingol at his kingdom in Doriath. And it's there that Galadriel meets the elf who will become her betrothed for thousands of years, Celeborn. Celeborn is a Sindar elf and a kinsman of Thingol. So, he and Galadriel are actually cousins, but distant enough that it's apparently not weird to the elves of Middle-earth. Being a Sindar elf, Celeborn has never been to the west. Now, he'll sail there years after the War of the Ring, but at this point in the First Age, he's never set foot in Aman. And that will be important when we reach the end of the First Age. So we'll come back to that. And as we launch into this phase of Galadriel's long life, I'm going to bring back part of a quote from the last video because it's very relevant to what we're about to discuss. In the Unfinished Tales, Christopher Tolkien writes, "There is no part of the history of Middle-earth more full of problems than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn. And it must be admitted that there are several inconsistencies embedded in the traditions." So, picking a narrative for Galadriel in the First and Second Age is tricky. And I don't want to get lost in the weeds with a million different sub-references. I suppose that video would be useful as a sleep aid. But what we're trying to do is tell a story here. So I'm going to tell the story of Galadriel, and where there's a notable inconsistency, I'll mention it and move on. So Galadriel and Finrod are in Doriath. Great Uncle Thingol tells Finrod about this really cool cave system that could be used to replicate Thingol's halls of Menegroth, aka the Thousand Caves, which is an awesome name. Finrod thinks it's a great idea, and he departs to create his stronghold, Nargothrond. But Galadriel stays in Doriath, mainly because Celeborn is there. But it also gives her the chance to learn from Thingol's wife, the Maya spirit, Queen Melian. Though I'll say that Melian is also learning from Galadriel. This is a quote from the Silmarillion, and it's great because we get a conversation, actual dialogue, between Melian and Galadriel. Silmarillion, chapter 15. At times, Melian and Galadriel would speak together of Valinor and the bliss of old. But beyond the dark hour of the death of the trees, Galadriel would not go, but ever fell silent. And on a time, Melian said, "There is some woe that lies upon you and your kin. That I can see in you. But all else is hidden from me. For by no vision or thought can I perceive anything that passed or passes in the west. A shadow lies over all the land of Aman and reaches far out over the sea. Why will you not tell me more?" "For that woe is past," said Galadriel, "and I would take what joy is here left untroubled by memory. And maybe there is woe enough yet to come, though still hope may seem bright." Then Melian looked her in the eyes and said, "I believe not that the Noldor came forth as messengers of the Valar, as was said at first. Not though they came in the very hour of our need, for they speak never of the Valar, nor have their high lords brought any message to Thingol, whether from Manwë or Ulmo, or even from Olwë, the king's brother, and his own folk that went over the sea. For what cause, Galadriel, were the high people of the Noldor driven forth as exiles from Aman? Or what evil lies on the sons of Feanor, that they are so haughty and so fell? Do I not strike near the truth? Near, said Galadriel, save that we were not driven forth, but came of our own will, and against that of the Valar. And through great peril, and in despite of the Valar, for this purpose we came, to take vengeance upon Morgoth, and regain what he stole. Then Galadriel spoke to Melian of the Silmarils, and of the slaying of King Finwë at Formenos. But still she said no word of the oath, nor of the kinslaying, nor of the burning of the ships at Lusgar. But Melian said, Now much you tell me, and yet more I perceive. A darkness you would cast over the long road from Tirion, but I see evil there, which Thingol should learn for his guidance. Maybe, said Galadriel, but not from me. And Melian spoke then no more of these matters with Galadriel, but she told to King Thingol all that she had heard of the Silmarils. Then Thingol was silent, being filled with grief and foreboding. But at length he said, Now at last I understand the coming of the Noldor out of the west, at which I wondered much before. Not to our aid did they come, save by chance. For vengeance and redress of their loss the Noldor came. Yet all the more sure shall they be as allies against Morgoth. But Melian said, Truly for these causes they came, but for others also. Beware of the sons of Feanor. The shadow of the wrath of the Valar lies upon them, and they have done evil, I perceive, both in Aman and to their own kin. Their swords and their counsels shall have two edges. This is a really enlightening series of conversations, not just because Melian pulls important information from Galadriel, but because she has to. We see that Galadriel and all of the Noldor are keeping the shame of the kinslaying secret. And that has to weigh on Galadriel, holding back that information for all those years. Yes, she reveals quite a bit to Melian, who guesses the rest. Beware the sons of Feanor. But Thingol still sees the sons of Feanor as allies against Morgoth. Galadriel has to know that the second Thingol finds out what the sons of Feanor did to his brother, killing many of the elves of Aqualande and stealing, then burning their ships, he will hate the Noldor. This eventually comes to pass, and he reacts as expected. So carrying that secret shame while living amongst the Sindar must have been an emotional burden for Galadriel. She couldn't even tell Celeborn. Eventually, Galadriel's brothers come to visit her in Doriath, and it's during that visit that her brother Angrod reveals the entire truth to Thingol. Hi, Boo-Boo. You want to come up? All right, here we go. Okay. Good girl. He angrily kicks him out of Doriath, though he does say it's not a permanent ban. And the line is, Then the sons of Finarfin departed from Menegroth with heavy hearts. It does say sons. That suggests that Galadriel gets to stay? Maybe her earlier confession to Melian gets her off the hook? Though in the very next paragraph, she's visiting Finrod in Nargothrond. So perhaps she leaves with her brothers. This paragraph is important because it foreshadows the fate of her brother, Finrod. Silmarillion, chapter 15. It came to pass that Nargothrond was full wrought, and the sons of Finarfin were gathered there to a feast. And Galadriel came from Doriath, and dwelt a while in Nargothrond. Now King Finrod Felagund had no wife, and Galadriel asked him why this should be. But foresight came upon Felagund as she spoke, and he said, An oath I too shall swear, and must be free to fulfill it, and go into darkness. Nor shall anything of my realm endure that a son should inherit. But it is said that not until that hour had such cold thoughts ruled him. For indeed, she whom he had loved was a Marié of the Vanyar, and she went not with him into exile. So, Galadriel has been in Doriath, learning lore from Melian, building a relationship with and ultimately marrying Celeborn. And then she comes to stay for a while in her brother's realm of Nargothrond. If I had to guess, I'd say Celeborn stayed behind in Doriath. And while there, she has to ask, "Hey, brother, why are you still single?" As siblings do. And that question brings on this haunting prophetic vision in Finrod, foretelling the fall of his realm and of his own death due to an oath. And that oath leads him to sacrifice himself for the hero Beren, of Beren and Luthien fame. And Nargothrond gets wrecked by Glaurung, the father of dragons. The good news is that Finrod's noble actions allow him to live again in Aman, presumably with his true love, Amarie. I did a video on Finrod if you want more information on him. And you'd think that Galadriel, being his sister, would know that the main reason Finrod hasn't found someone in Middle-earth is that he's carrying a torch for Amarie back in Aman. The question seems a little bit insensitive, frankly. But after a time, Galadriel's visit to her brother is over, and she returns to Doriath. One of the most important observations Galadriel makes during her time with Melian is the magical defense of Doriath, known as the Girdle of Melian. It's an incredibly powerful protective spell. Here's a description from the Silmarillion, chapter 10. And when Thingol came again to Menegroth, he learned that the orc host in the west was victorious, and had driven Círdan to the rim of the sea. Therefore he withdrew all his people that his summons could reach. And Melian put forth her power, and fenced all that dominion round about with an unseen wall of shadow and bewilderment. The Girdle of Melian, that none thereafter could pass against her will or the will of King Thingol, unless one should come with a power greater than that of Melian the Maya. This enchantment essentially walls off Doriath from any unwelcome outsiders. And though I'm going to skip ahead to the Third Age for a second, I just want to show how Galadriel's defense of Lothlorien is informed by her experience in Doriath. This is from the Fellowship of the Ring, Book 2, Chapter 7, The Mirror of Galadriel. But do not think that only by singing amid the trees, or even by the slender arrows of elven bows, is this land of Lothlorien maintained and defended against its enemy. I say to you, Frodo, that even as I speak to you, I perceive the Dark Lord and know his mind, or all of his mind that concerns the elves. And he gropes ever to see me and my thought, but still the door is closed. So, using her own considerable powers, and the powers of the elven ring, Nenya, the ring of water, which we'll talk about in the next video, Galadriel seeks to create her own version of the Girdle of Melian around Lothlorien. But note the line from the earlier quote that read, "None thereafter could pass against her will, or the will of King Thingol, unless one should come with a power greater than that of Melian the Maya." Well, you don't give that caveat unless it's going to come to pass. It's Chekhov's girdle. And the power that overcomes the enchantment is Beren, who will go on to marry Luthien, Melian and Thingol's daughter. Silmarillion, Chapter 17. King Thingol was ill-pleased, because he was troubled by dreams concerning the coming of men, ere ever the first tidings of them were heard. Therefore he commanded that men should take no lands to dwell in save in the north, and that the princes whom they served should be answerable for all that they did. And he said, Into Doriath shall no man come while my realm lasts, not even those of the house of Beor who serve Finrod the Beloved. Melian said nothing to him at that time, but afterwards she said to Galadriel, Now the world runs on swiftly to great tidings, and one of men, even of Beor's house, shall indeed come, and the Girdle of Melian shall not restrain him, for doom greater than my power shall send him. And the songs that shall spring from that coming shall endure when all Middle-earth is changed. I love that last line. The songs that shall spring from that coming shall endure when all Middle-earth is changed. Because this is where we see these storylines and character arcs intersect. Beren breaks through the enchantment, hears Luthien, they fall in love. Thingol gives him an impossible quest, hoping he'll give up or die trying. But together with Luthien, they actually pull off the heist of the Millennium, stealing back a Silmaril from Morgoth. And in that tale, Finrod, Galadriel's brother, duels Sauron in defense of Beren and ultimately meets his end fighting and killing a werewolf with his bare hands to save Beren's life. Another way this event impacts Galadriel is that one of the descendants of Beren and Luthien is Elrond, who marries Galadriel's daughter, Celeborn. And so, Galadriel's granddaughter, Arwen, unites these epic tales in a single thread. The rest of the First Age is a bit hazy for the history of Galadriel, but there is a helpful quote from that same Mirror of Galadriel chapter in the Fellowship of the Ring. Here we actually see Galadriel chalking up Celeborn's resume. For the Lord of the Galadhrim is accounted the wisest of the elves of Middle-earth, and a giver of gifts beyond the power of kings. He has dwelt in the west since the days of dawn, and I have dwelt with him years uncounted. For ere the fall of Nargothrond or Gondolin, I passed over the mountains, and together through ages of the world we have fought the long defeat. This quote gives us some date ranges. It says, for ere the fall of Nargothrond or Gondolin, I passed over the mountains. Nargothrond, the realm started by her brother and where she dwelled for a time, was sacked by Glaurung in 495 of the First Age. Gondolin fell after that. And from my earlier Girdle of Melian quote, we get this passage starting with Thingol. He said, into Doriath shall no man come while my realm lasts, not even those of the house of Beor who serve Finrod the Beloved. Melian said nothing to him at that time, but afterwards she said to Galadriel, now the world runs on swiftly to great tidings. So, Galadriel was still in Doriath after her brother Finrod befriended the house of Beor. That happens in 310. So, sometime between 310 and 495 of the First Age, Galadriel and Celeborn travel east and pass over the mountains. Those would be the Blue Mountains, which after the War of Wrath are just east of the newly created coastline. As a reference, the War of Wrath begins in 545 of the First Age. This means that Galadriel avoids the war entirely, separating herself from the violent, calamitous events that end the First Age. And she's not alone in doing that. According to the Silmarillion, most of the elves living in Middle-earth at the time of the War of Wrath did not participate. Here's the quote. Silmarillion, chapter 24. But the host of the Valar prepared for battle, and beneath their white banners marched the Vanyar, the people of Ingwe, and those also of the Noldor, who never departed from Valinor, whose leader was Finarfin, the son of Finwë, Galadriel's dad. Of the march of the host of the Valar to the north of Middle-earth, little is said in any tale. For among them went none of those elves who had dwelt and suffered in the hitherlands, and who made the histories of those days that still are known. And tidings of these things they only learned long afterwards from their kinsfolk in Aman. The meeting of the hosts of the west and of the north is named the Great Battle and the War of Wrath. So we learn a few interesting tidbits from that quote. First, there were Noldor elves in the host of the Valar, but they were the Noldor from Aman, and they were led by Galadriel's father, Finarfin. And we learn that none of the elves from the Hitherlands, essentially Middle-earth, were included in the host. That's a little tough to believe, since the war lasted for over 40 years. Maybe the locals fought in some smaller skirmishes during that 40-year period, but were not considered part of the army of the West. All that said, I think given the distance Galadriel put between herself and Morgoth, I doubt she did any fighting, even unofficially. And it's sad to think that her father was relatively close, on the same continent at least, for decades before heading back to Aman, but we don't get any evidence that they reunited. She was his last surviving child at that point. Perhaps, after the war, Finarfin paid a visit to Galadriel before departing. Now, they would eventually be reunited thousands of years later after the War of the Ring. So, we come to the end of the First Age. Morgoth has been defeated, sent to the Void. Beleriand has been decimated in the process, leaving much of it underwater. Hence, it's fortunate that Galadriel is on the east side of the mountains. The doom of Mandos is lifted, and the Noldor are permitted to return to Aman. Most of them do. You know what? This field trip to the east didn't go so well. I think I'll return to paradise now. But here is where Galadriel makes a controversial decision that she will come to regret, as evidenced by her lament in The Lord of the Rings, which I discussed in the first video. Galadriel says to the Valar, "Thanks, but no thanks. I'm staying." To which the Valar respond, "Oh yeah? Well, you can't dump us. We dump you first. It's a one-time limited offer, and now you can never come back even if you change your mind." We'll talk about how that gets rescinded when we reach the Third Age. But this fracture between Galadriel and the West holds for thousands of years. And indeed, she is the very last member of the rebellious, exiled Noldor to finally return to the West. Maybe Maglor's out there somewhere. So why? Why didn't she go back after the War of Wrath? We get a few clues in this passage from Unfinished Tales. This is from the chapter entitled History of Galadriel and Celeborn. Galadriel was the daughter of Finarfin and sister of Finrod Felagund. She was welcome in Doriath because her mother, Eärwen, daughter of Olwe, was Telerin and the niece of Thingol, and because the people of Finarfin had had no part in the kinslaying of Aquilande, and she became a friend of Melian. In Doriath, she met Celeborn, grandson of Elmo, the brother of Thingol. For love of Celeborn, who would not leave Middle-earth, and probably with some pride of her own, for she had been one of those eager to adventure there, she did not go west at the downfall of Melkor, but crossed Arid Linden, the Blue Mountains, with Celeborn, and came into Eriador. When they entered that region, there were many Noldor in their following, together with Grey Elves and Green Elves, and for a while they dwelt in the country about Lake Evendim, north of the Shire. Celeborn and Galadriel came to be regarded as Lord and Lady of the Eldar in Eriador. Remember, at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that Celeborn's affinity for Middle-earth would come into play. Well, sure enough, he's never been to the West. It's not his home. Middle-earth is his home, and he's not leaving. So part of the reason Galadriel stays is to be with him. But the quote also mentions pride. It's admitting failure if she returns. As though all of this was just a big waste of time, and, I'm so thankful that you're taking me back. You were right. It's a hard pill to swallow. A blow to the ego that she just can't abide. And I think she genuinely likes Middle-earth and her place in it. This is one of those hazy canonical issues. Was she banned? Did she stay out of her own volition? There are quotes supporting either position. But I think the narrative I laid out makes the most sense. She was offered a pardon, refused it, and so the pardon was rescinded. We also see at the end of that quote that Galadriel and Celeborn pick up a following and become known as the Lord and Lady of the Eldar in Eriador. Green Elves, Grey Elves, and other Noldor who made the same choice to stay that Galadriel did. And they lived for quite a while, hundreds of years, at Lake Evendim. That area is just north of where the Shire will be in the Third Age, and it's where Elendil will eventually make his capital city of Anúminas at the end of the Second Age. Just hearkening back to this momentous decision of Galadriel to refuse to return to Aman, I found an interesting quote in one of Tolkien's letters. Now, he's talking about elves in general, but man, it sounds like he's talking specifically about Galadriel. Some reviewers have called the whole thing, The Lord of the Rings, simple-minded. Just a plain fight between good and evil, with all the good just good and the bad just bad. Pardonable, perhaps, though at least Boromir has been overlooked, in people in a hurry, and with only a fragment to read, and of course without the earlier written but unpublished elvish histories. But the elves are not wholly good or in the right. Not so much because they had flirted with Sauron, as because with or without his assistance, they were embalmers. They wanted to have their cake and eat it. To live in the mortal, historical Middle-earth because they'd become fond of it, and perhaps because they there had the advantages of a superior caste, and so tried to stop its change in history, stop its growth, and they were overburdened with sadness and nostalgic regret. I like that comparison to an embalmer. They're trying to crystallize a version of Middle-earth, a time period of Middle-earth that no longer exists. And as their control slips away, they're filled with this nostalgic regret. I think we see that with Galadriel and Lothlorien in the Third Age. And those are some powerful, dare I say, human emotions. So, the First Age is behind us now. Galadriel and Celeborn have a following at Lake Evendim. This lasts until about the year 750 of the Second Age, when they'll head even further east to Eregion. And that's where we're going to pick up Galadriel's story in the next video, meeting up with Celebrimbor and teeing up the events that will likely be chronicled in the Amazon series. So, thanks as always. Come on back for Galadriel in the Second Age, and I'll see you next time. Bye!